Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show.
Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I am your host, David Blackmon, and my very special guest today is Paul Hickin, who's the editor-in-chief of the Petroleum Economist publication, which is one of the finest industry-related publications going today. Paul, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, David. Thanks for having me on, and kind words for Petroleum Economist, which is now in its 90th year. So yeah, we hit our 90th year next year. So thanks very much.
It's among the oldest oil and gas related publications still in existence, right?
I believe so. Yeah, we've got a real archive. We should access them more. It's fascinating to look through sometimes to see, the birth of the OPEC meeting, 1960, and you can really, oil historians can have a field day with some of our old publications.
Yeah, I'm sure they could. Yeah, actually, that would be fascinating to me. I'm a bit of a history freak about the industry myself. Having been in it for so long, and I just can't get enough reading books about it. So yeah, I mean that would be actually fascinating. So you're at an oil conference there in London, right?
Yeah, I'm at the Argus Crude Summit. I think it's interesting because there aren't many oil conferences anymore in London. Energy Intelligence one which used to be called the Oil and Money. Obviously, they changed the name Energy Intelligence because probably wasn't the best optics. But still, it gets all the protests. It had Greta Thunberg. The protesters blocked even speakers at the event, such as Ben Luckock, who's the head of oil traffic bureau, and others couldn't get in. Lots of delegates. So end up having some of the panels, which you'd have 3 or 4 people on a panel, down to just a fireside chat, one-on-one. So they certainly got their aims, the activists, in terms of disrupting the event. This one, not so much. There's been a lot of security, but I guess the technicalities of price benchmarks and WTI and Brent are not so obvious targets for activists. So and maybe doesn't get the same. Maybe because there's no oil companies here, or energy companies, maybe don't get the same target. I think it's when you get a BP or a Shell that you seem to get the targets from the activists. So I think when you've got sort of more traders and analysts, it seems to, and a bit more technical, it seems to doesn't get the same activism.
Yeah. Nobody's gluing themselves to the streets outside or anything like that.
No, not about changing a benchmark. You might, Platts and Argus, a friendly fire over benchmarks.
Well, speaking of Shell and BP, you brought Shell and BP up, and I wasn't actually going to ask this, but we've had these 2 gigantic mergers here announced by ExxonMobil and Chevron over the last few weeks. And I'm starting to see rumors and hear rumors about Shell and BP yet again. This has been a frequent rumor that's popped up from time to time for 40 years now, or probably longer than that. Potentially looking at merging to become more competitive with an ExxonMobil that's going to be so gigantic now with Pioneer Resources added in. Are you hearing any of that talk in London?
Just very little, actually. I think it's still very quiet. It wasn't like some of these deals in the US where, even this year, there was really strong talk of some of those mergers happening. Whereas here it's slightly different because the bets on long-term oil are not the same. It's not with the same gusto as you would have in the US, where clearly Exxon, especially, has been very clear about their approach to oil and a bit of
Yeah.
strong approach to oil. And you have the shale play, which is a slightly different beast in terms of, if you're investing in oil, you can still kind of invest in oil, but kind of hedge your bets, in the sense that shale can get turned around pretty quickly and you get production up pretty quickly. So it's like different to some of maybe, if you're thinking about deep water plays or longer term projects, there's still the risk of stranded assets, and still concerns around policymakers' decisions. We had the UK government, for example, they've been flip-flopping over the North Sea. You had all the sort of blocks in 2020. You had the kind of killing of the North Sea oil industry, and
Right.
all about any transition, and then all of a sudden, the past year, you've had Rosebank be approved, which is quite a key oil project in the North Sea in the UK, and even talk about Cambo and others. And it's all optimism now going into next year about North Sea projects being approved. So there is a mood shift, but it's funny, because you see the UK government, which has been the same UK government for the past more than 10 years, blaming other leaders of the UK government to say, well, it was their fault. We've changed our mind because of them, but it's the same party. But it just shows how kind of governments are kind of all over the place as well, in terms of what's the right approach in terms of energy security versus meeting sort of optics on energy sustainability.
Well, it's been so fascinating to observe, here in the United States, the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, has been a lot slower to come around on these energy transition, climate change kind of issues than the Liberal Party, the Democrats. Where in England, in the UK, it feels to me like, and I think I'm right, that the Conservative Party has actually become the leader in those, because it's been in power for so long. It really is further down that road than the Labor Party, right, which has tried to differentiate itself by opposing some of those policies. Do you expect that to change in the run up to the next elections?
Well, I mean, it's been the clear sort of indication from that the Labour Party aren't going to change anything that's approved under this administration in the UK. So they're clearly going to honour anything. They don't want to. The Labour government don't, if they get into power, the Labour Party, if they become government, they don't want to kind of be seen as this kind of anti-business sentiment, changing policies again. And we've already had this sort of chopping and changing over the North Sea, which I've mentioned, which has been really unhelpful. The UK and the North Sea has been a sort of a bastion for sort of stable, clear environment, and that's been eradicated in a few years over the energy transition. And I think you see it with the US and across the West to some degree, about policymakers that they can't make up their minds. It's almost like, well, I think there's two things that's quite interesting here, which is one, the failed argument that failed to engage with the public about saying, if we don't invest here, we're going to be importing oil. We're not stopping oil, we're just importing it, which means it's going to go on ships. It's going to be more pollution on ships, going longer distances. It could be actually dirtier oil, less ESG practices getting out the ground, because obviously the West, they're being held more account in terms of trying to make it cleaner, lower carbon footprints, getting the oil out. You're not going to be doing that if you're importing it. You could be getting it from Iraq or wherever, which is, has a much dirtier carbon footprint. So there's that. And I think the other thing which you mentioned, which is quite interesting, is that it cuts across party lines, this kind of energy transition, because you could say, is it a left issue or is it a right issue for these things? It's not clear, because if you talk about energy poverty, you'd argue that's a left issue of the left, and yet some of the left have been tied up in lots of kind of environmental arguments, and so they don't know whether to go clean, and appeal to the sort of more sort of middle class latte drinking socialists, or to the kind of actual poor who actually really need energy and access to energy, not just in. And you see this across Europe with gas, I think, which has been a clear one with the Russia crisis. Germany, UK, switching on coal plants. All of a sudden, 1 minute gas was even a problem for Europe, and then we need to move away from gas. It's still a hydrocarbon. It's still a fossil fuel. Then all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, we're going to put on coal plant. We're going to turn back on coal, and we probably need to
Right.
import LNG from the US, which is even going to be more of a problem than getting the gas out the ground closer to home. So it's completely confused, and I think that push to any transition has really confused the policymakers, and it doesn't help any business at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that the same things happen in the United States. I think the Biden government in particular is in the process of destroying one of our country's main assets for attracting investment has been the predictability of our legal system and our regulatory system. And I think, unfortunately, the Biden government has really done a lot of harm to that asset that we've had, because companies, in order to make these long-term multi-billion-dollar investments, have to feel like they understand, how the government's going to react to that and regulate it. And there's no predictability in that anymore. And I mean, it's not just the Biden government. It's also the fact that we change presidents every 4 years, and so it goes back and forth. It's a real problem. And to me, Paul, it points to something I always say, and I truly believe, is that we almost have the very worst class of people in our societies, in democratic societies, making these energy policy decisions, which is the political class, because their decisions are almost always based on whichever side of an issue is giving them the most money for their next reelection campaign. Can you think of any worse class to be making these decisions for the rest of us?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, in that sense, democracy. Well, I think there's two things. One, democracy is clearly broken. I mean, because you've got certain things which go on. I mean, in terms of, there's the funding issue, which is one thing, but also, like I talked to some of the CEOs of energy companies. They say policymakers are all on board, and they're talking about we need an orderly transition. We need to still invest in oil and gas for long-term security, and then they leave those private meetings, and then publicly they come out and say, boo boo, oil and gas is the next is evil, or something to those effects. So it's a problem, because policymakers aren't necessarily being honest, and and it's tricky. I mean, in the UK, we've got Just Stop Oil, for example. I don't know if you heard that movement in the UK, Just Stop Oil, which I think smacks of every sort of poorly constructed narrative that you could have. I mean, where do you start? I mean, do they not care about stopping coal? Why just stop oil? Do they think we're going to go back to horse and cart, or just do you think public transport doesn't run on oil, or what? Do they think EVs are not, cars are still going to have some oil-based products? Paints, the mining of metals. I mean, at the moment, unless you're going green, you're greening the mining process, but still, we're still, I don't think it's just no one is sort of engaging honestly about these conversations, and the cost of any renewables, not only the intermittent nature, but the cost of them. And let's face it, if the transition was a real workable solution, it would have happened. It wouldn't need
What happen in the market, right?
It happened. The market happens. If it was generally cheaper, better economically, more convenient and more useful, all these things that are replacing oil or coal even, then it would have happened. But I think you just go back to coal is a classic example. With you don't have to bash oil. You could just look at coal. China, India, Indonesia, Poland, Germany. There's huge amounts of coal use. Some of these countries are all pretty much dominated by coal still. And you could do more for the transition if you got these places and these consumers off of coal and onto gas, another fossil fuel, than you could do by producing all the EVs you want. So I think these honest conversations just not being had in any kind of broader circles or even public circles. It's just not enough debate on this. And I'm not saying I'm right about some of these things, but the idea of liquid fuels, biofuels in transport, could do more than you could do by rolling out more electric vehicles, for example. There is,
Right.
and it's clear. I'm not saying EVs may not be a solution. My 5-year-old loves his electric vehicle driving around, but even then he complains about charging. It has to be charged overnight every day. So, and where's that electricity come from? Gas. So, because we're heating, our natural gas gets, people think the magic of electricity. It's green, but I was in Calgary for the WPC Energy, the World Petroleum Congress in September.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone there, and they run a electric vehicle in Alberta, in which was on hydro. They moved states, and they had to run it all. The electricity was coming all from oil, so on gas. So that shows the complexity of it. So yeah.
So we've in the United States, speaking of renewables and electric vehicles, and I've written a lot about this recently, is the electric vehicle and wind industries both are showing some pretty clear signs of financial distress at the moment, particularly in the wind industry, probably even more so than the electric vehicle industry. Ørsted is obviously having pretty significant financial issues, and BP and Equinor just took big write-downs on their U.S. projects. Are you seeing similar signs of financial difficulties in those industries in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about subsidies. I mean, just certainly that. I think, I mean, solar as well. Trying to, wind. I mean, wind has been a fairly successful part of the UK. I mean,
Yeah,
we've got
it has
the
in
North
Texas
Sea.
too.
You've got the weather for it, and but I think the other thing is people don't talk about as much is nuclear. I mean,
Right.
I think the public policy shift away from nuclear in Europe, apart from France, but Germany made a huge mistake, you could argue. If you really want transition, if you really want clean energy, nuclear is the only real viable option. It has its problems, obviously, but that's the real but politically it's still slightly unpalatable in many places.
Yeah.
Obviously if nuclear goes wrong, it's Chernobyl, but or Fukushima,
but not with the new generation technologies, right? I mean, molten salt and these other advanced technologies really protect against that, and yet
yeah,
it's still, it's still having a hard time getting acceptance. I totally agree with that. I'm working on a story about a project that's underway here in Texas, a molten salt project that is really well advanced. Is going to go live in 2025 here in Texas, and so I completely agree with you. I think nuclear, we're going to have a vast expansion of nuclear if you're ever really going to reduce emissions significantly.
But there's not that much talk about. There's not that much talk about it in many circles. I mean, I don't want to sound like some sort of apologist for oil and this is why I mentioned coal and the problems with coal or the solutions of nuclear, because it's if given the amount of energy demand that's like to be in the future, and I think you see this with the OPEC and the IEA, and IEA's clearly had its own weird estimations around long-term demand, but for energy. But if you think about demand for energy in the future, you think of parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, urbanization as a big, a shift in some of these some of these continents and countries, the shift to urbanization and getting people actually access to energy. I don't want to spit out facts about how few people have access to electricity or energy in Africa, but if you're going to get all these people into a lifestyle that we're accustomed to, then you're going to need so much energy. You're going to need more of everything: oil, gas, renewables. We're going to need everything.
Well, and there doesn't seem to be any really broad recognition that in these global organizations. I laughed out loud when I saw the report from the IEA the International Energy Agency, a few weeks ago, on power generation and the needs to upgrade the grids globally. And they're talking about we're going to need 50 million miles, 80 million kilometers of refurbished and new transmission built globally by 2040. Now that is 2,000 times the circumference of the Earth that they're talking about. And there is, you read through that report and there's just almost no discussion about where is all the resources going to come from to do that? Where's the copper going to come from? Where's the workforce going to come from? It often feels to me like these global age groups, like the IEA, like the UN, the COP28 conferences that is coming up at the 1st of December. It's almost like they're dealing in just fairy tales about.
Yeah, well, the Saudi Arabia. What did Saudi Arabia say when IEA first produced its landmark report a few years back? He called it La La Land.
Yeah.
You know, that's what it called it. I mean, you don't have. You can still believe. To try and work towards a cleaner environment without we're still being realistic with the sort of the practical solutions, the numbers that are needed. I mean, you talk about an interesting point there, which is electrification. You know, it's the elephant in the room in terms of the energy transition. You know, the grids that are going to need it, the like you said, the copper. I mean, the cost of copper. I mean, if we were really as a globe to get there in terms of electrification, you know, it's just not practical. It's not a practical solution. I mean, it's in that sense. If you really worry about the environment, then actually it's worrying, because the reality is we're not going to get there, and you're going to need kind of ways to decarbonize, get fossil fuels cleaner. I think they think that there's the false narrative, which is we need to move off of fossil fuels to other fuels, which is you could look at it the other way, which is we need to clean up fossil fuels. You know, there's so much work being done in that space in terms of efficiencies, biofuels, decarbonizing the upstream process, decarbonizing all the upstream side,
carbon capture. I mean, carbon capture and
CCUS.
storage.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much out there that can be done. I mean, hydrogen. You know, hydrogen as a way of cleaning up the refining process. You know, I mean, it's happening. You know, and what you really need is the policy support to help the industry be as clean as possible, because fossil fuels are going to stay. So if you're really going to think about an honest solution, you need to be helping a cleaner fossil fuels. You know, I'm not saying green fossil fuels, but cleaner fossil fuels, and rather than this kind of just bashing and trying to move on to sort of bizarre solutions like solar in the UK or something, which is, you know, we don't have much sun here. You know.
And that's what drives me crazy about this is we have an existing energy delivery system that has worked so well for a century and more. And instead of, if you would invest a fraction of the trillions and trillions of dollars that these governments are planning to invest in doing away with the current energy system and replacing it with something that everyone knows isn't going to really work, for a fraction of that cost, you could clean up the current energy system to a point where none of this is really a problem. But there's literally no one thinking on those terms at the policymaker level. And so you end up with I've interviewed on this podcast alone and in my other interviews in the writing I do, I've interviewed now 20 CEOs in all aspects of the energy space, from renewables to batteries to oil and gas, nuclear. Literally every one of those CEOs, when I asked them about, well, what's driving your project, every one of them points to the subsidies in the IRA or in the previous infrastructure law that are there for them to access. So these subsidies in the US anyway are literally driving everything that's happening. And I assume it's probably a similar situation in Europe. There's this rush to take advantage of the subsidies, and you can't really blame these startups or the corporations that are doing it. because the money's there. It's easy money and you can make profits. And so why not?
Yeah. And you've got the flip side, which is, it's this sort of tax, this sort of punitive tax regime that when oil prices went high, you got from the flip side, you've got all this sort of punitive fiscal tax frameworks for oil companies, like bashing them, a way of taking profits out of them. But if you want them to invest in clean energy, if you want them to actually you want them to do more investment, you should be, helping them channel their profits into, it should be like high oil prices. And the sort of sad thing about this as well is that there's a big risk of us having higher prices for longer. And that's due to that will be fed by a lack of investment into oil because of risk of stranded assets, because of these kind of policy moves away from oil, because of the bashing it gets, because of ESG. And that could mean it could be lack of investment in oil. And what's going to happen? Higher oil prices, which we're still going to need unless demand magically disappears. And it's clearly not. So a lot of these things are really counterproductive, to the shifts. And like we were saying about taxation as well, it's the same problem. I mean, it's bizarre that people sort of bash the oil companies, but anyone else who makes profit seems to be okay. Like not to target Amazon or someone else, but what are Amazon doing? They're sending all their cargoes on container ships. Are they using wind container ships, or are they using fossil fuels mostly, or at least dual fuel ships? And which are likely bunker fuels or marine fuel, oil-based fuels. So I mean, just the lack of honesty again. It gets people caught up with lots of showing that all these contradictions that are going on, which is the saddest situation.
One positive aspect of all this, I always sound so negative on this show, but there is a positive aspect I'm seeing, and that is that as the awareness rises in the media about the costs of all this expanding, cost of all forms of energy have skyrocketed here over the past few years. I'm sensing an increased interest in all of this just from the general public. Are you seeing that at the Petroleum Economist too, just in terms of readership?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, exactly. And I think there's the other thing, which is the really important point you raised, which is energy complacency. I think at least in the West, we've had, probably since the Arab oil embargo of 74, 75, we haven't had a real energy crisis, so much so the IEA, what was the IEA set up for? It was set up for, because of that crisis, to provide stocks, to keep stocks, 90 days worth of stocks in oil to provide energy security. But over probably only the past 5 years or so, the IEA's really shifted away from that kind of narrative to a large degree. Probably about when I first interviewed Fatih Birol, who leads the IEA. When I first interviewed him, he was still very much talking about shale. Shale was the big boom time. It was unprecedented growth. And now, anytime you interview, I interviewed him earlier this year. Went to Paris and interviewed him, and it was all about an orderly transition. I mean, to be fair, to his credit, when he talks about it, he still talks about emissions the problem and not fossil fuels. He does try to, but it's the IEA forecast which have got them all more muddled. But to be fair to him, he has talked up, in terms of orderly transition, but it's clearly a shift away from that move from talking about oil to energy transition, and you end up this energy complacency. I want to go back to the point I mentioned before, which is with the Russia crisis, and now what we've seen with the sad events in Gaza. People look at coal being resurrected, and you think, hold on a minute, energy security starts to become a huge issue. People start putting more jumpers on. Industry starts to talk about how we can manage demand and reduce demand. And so that energy capacity has been shook up, and I think that's the one positive, that to actually start valuing such an important commodity as energy.
Well, we're running up against time here. These half hours always go too fast, and it just occurred to me I should have said up front, in the interest of disclosure, that I am a contributing writer at the Petroleum Economist. So Paul is actually my boss in that role, and I appreciate him taking the time to come on. Tell our audience where they can reach the Petroleum Economist and keep up with things that are going there.
Yeah, thank you, David. So we've got the PE Media Network. People can log in. You can get a trial to the PE Media Network. We have Petroleum Economist, which covers oil and gas and LNG, and then we've also got Hydrogen Economist and Carbon Economist, which also covers CCUS and tracks. We've got a whole database of tracking carbon and hydrogen projects, pipeline projects as well. So so clearly, if anyone's interested in the sort of everything to do with the hydrocarbon space and what they're doing around that, please get in touch with me or check out our site for sure.
Well, wonderful, man. This has just been great. I'll let you get back to your conference. I really appreciate your time. And,
brilliant. Thanks so much, David, for having me on.
And by the way, thank you for having me as a writer at the PE. It's a real honor for me, frankly. I've always had tremendous amount of respect for the publication and the work you do.
No, I love having your contributions, David. They're really insightful, very valuable. Thank you very much as well.
Well, thank you, and thanks to our producer extraordinaire, Eric Perel, the Sandstone Group for hosting our podcast, and to the U.S. Oil and Gas Association for being our sponsor. I'm David Blackmon, and that's all for today.